Now, he's a Democrat from Maine who led the Senate from 1989 to 1995. For 6 consecutive years, he was voted the most respected member of the Senate. Time magazine named him among the 100 most influential persons in the world. He was nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize. He received the Presidential Medal of Freedom. Here in Ireland, we know him best from his key role as special advisor for President Bill Clinton to the Northern Ireland peace process, and his work as a special envoy to the Middle East under President Barack Obama in 2009 to 2011. Not bad for the son of a janitor from Maine. I am, of course, talking about the iconic Senator George Mitchell, who's here in Dublin to attend the Ireland Inc. 2013 Business and Finance Awards at the Convention Centre this evening, where he's being honoured with a special award for outstanding contribution to Ireland. Senator George Mitchell, you're very welcome to the programme.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure for me to be here with you.
It took me a while to get through all that, but yours is an extraordinary story.
Well, thank you. It's been an exciting time, and one of the highlights of it was my service in Northern Ireland. My father's parents were born in Ireland, lived most of their lives there, then emigrated to the United States. He was born in the U.S., but he never knew his parents. He was raised in an orphanage.
Will you explain to me Kilroy Mitchell?
Yes. My father's father was named Kilroy.
Okay.
When they got to the United States, shortly after that, they had a child, he and his wife, and that was my father. But his mother died. The father couldn't care for the children, and so my father never knew his parents. He was raised in an orphanage in Boston run by Catholic nuns. After several years there, it's an interesting story. The nuns would take these children out on the weekends to the Catholic churches in the rural areas of New England. And at the end of the Mass, the children would be lined up in front of the church, and anybody who wanted to adopt someone just took them and walked out with them. Obviously, a great potential for abuse, and there was a lot of abuse, particularly in the rural areas.
But great potential for sadness as well. I mean, you can, in your mind's eye, picture these little children, and they're eyeballing these adults and thinking that could be a mummy or a daddy for me.
My father was very lucky. He was adopted by an elderly, childless couple who were not Irish. And so he walked into the church that day as Joseph Kilroy, and he walked out as George Mitchell. No papers, no formalities. My father didn't have much education and had a tough life. He was a janitor and a laborer, and he never knew anything about Ireland. I never heard him say the word. He had no conception of his background for many years, then later was reunited with his older brother and became aware of his family history. So for me to come here at a late stage in my life and to be exposed to the heritage of my grandparents, of which I had been previously not very much aware, it was just, for me, a great opportunity and a wonderful experience.
Now, you are, of course, a lovely DNA mixture of mother and father, and we'll talk about your mother in a moment. Yeah. But did you track down any Kilroys, or were they trackable at this remove?
I received a lot of calls and letters from people saying that they thought we were related, but have never been able to make any real connection. I got a lot of correspondence, and people wrote me a lot when I was over here. And I got a letter from a man one day who enclosed a map which purported to be the location of every Irish family name, where they came from. The O'Briens were from here, the Fitzgeralds from there. And it said that the Kilroys came from West Clare. But honestly, I have no idea whether that's true. I had one guy say to me in a joking way, he said, "Senator, if you pay enough money, we'll connect you to Brian Boru." I said, well, so we haven't really done much research on
Because I recall when Ronald Reagan was here, and we all went to Ballyporeen, and I was reporting on it, and there was a certain amount of cynicism. You know, is this the old playing the Irish card, re-election and all of that? Yeah. And are these people really related to Ronald Reagan? And I remember before the broadcast, we all gathered together to be vetted by the Secret Service and make sure we weren't carrying any weapons or drink or something like that might affect things. And I met the Reagans, or the Regans as we call them, and one of them was Ronald Reagan to the nth degree.
Really?
Absolutely, one of the cousins, and he was slightly more careworn, more grey-haired, but then maybe Ronald took a little Hollywood help with his hair. But I was astonished, so I'm wondering if you went to Clare, subtracting your mother's DNA, which is very different from, would you see fellas that look just like George Mitchell walking around the place?
I don't know. I have been to Clare. I've been through much of Ireland since then. I had never been to Northern Ireland before I was assigned to go there by President Clinton, and I'd only been here in the Republic of Ireland once for a couple of days vacation. So I didn't really have much of a grasp of it. I did start on a program of intense self-education. I think I read about 40 books and hundreds of articles and magazines. And, of course, once you get interested in Ireland and Irish history, why, it's like a bottomless well. You just keep going. So for me, it's been a great experience. I love it. Last year, I took my wife and children to Northern Ireland. The BBC did a nice documentary on me and my son. And we spent a week traveling around Northern Ireland. We had a great time, and the one thing my children wanted was the chance to come to the south, here to the Republic of Ireland, on a similar trip, and we're planning that for some time in the near future.
Now, tell me about your mother, the other half of you.
Yes. My mother was born in Lebanon. She was what's called a Maronite Catholic. The Maronite Church is the eastern branch of the Roman Catholic Church, and in the period before the First World War, the British and French governments, being the colonial powers of the time, forced the Ottoman Turks, who were in steep decline, to enact a series of laws ostensibly to protect the Christian minority in the region. And one of the laws they insisted be passed was that everyone in the Ottoman Empire be treated equally, including Christians, which is a good idea and sounds good. However, one of the inequalities which they had suffered under was that Christians were not subject to be drafted into the Ottoman army. Because the Ottomans didn't trust them to be in their army. Well, once they passed this law, they all started being drafted, so they didn't like equality quite so much then, and that led to one of the periodic surges of out-migration. I don't know if that had anything to do with it, but my mother and two of her sisters emigrated to the United States during that period. She was 18 years old in 1920, went through Ellis Island, went to stay with her sister who lived in Maine, and by complete coincidence, my father's family lived next door.
And the rest is marital history.
History, right.
Now, your own ascent to greatness, you joined the army. Now, was that a key to opening up a whole new world to you?
I felt, matured me more than anything I'd ever done in terms of opening up the world. And it did help me in a certain way. For example, when I graduated from college and went into the Army, I was assigned to go to Berlin, Germany. I flew from New York to Frankfurt the first time I'd ever been on an airplane. Then I took the train from Frankfurt to Berlin the first time I'd ever been on a train. My parents were very poor. We didn't own a car. My parents really never went anywhere. And so I had an extremely limited range of vision until that time. And I loved being in the U.S. Army. I thought it was a great opportunity. I enjoyed my time in Berlin very much. And it did have, I think, a great maturing effect on me.
Your road to politics wasn't direct. I mean, you weren't someone who, from graduation, said, I want to be a state senator, then a U.S. senator, then whatever. That wasn't how it happened.
It was not. It was a complete accident. After I got out of the Army, I went to law school. And when I graduated, my goal in life was to return to my home state of Maine to practice law. But I couldn't get a job. I applied to 15 law firms. That only 2 of them asked me to come for an interview, and both of them wouldn't hire me. So I was pretty downcast and discouraged, but I received an offer from the United States Department of Justice under an honors graduate program that they had, which I'd not been aware of before. And so I went to work in the Justice Department just about the time that John Kennedy was elected president and Robert Kennedy was the Attorney General. A couple of years later, I was frustrated, wanting to return to my home state of Maine, when one of the senators from Maine knew of my family, not of me. My older brothers were very prominent athletes, and he knew of them. He had a vacancy in his staff, and he called me and asked me if I'd come up for an interview and offered me a job. And I said to him, I'm not interested in politics. I want to go back to Maine and practice law, so I will accept as long as you know that my real goal is to get a job. He said, if you'll stay with me until the next election, it's a deal. That was 2.5 years. So I said, I'll stay during that time. And as things worked out, two things happened. I liked politics, and I ended up getting a job with a law firm in Maine. So I went back. I began practicing law, but by then I was fully immersed in politics.
Fast forwarding, I mean, you got to the Senate and you were hugely influential and respected. And I wonder what your thoughts are now on how torn the Senate is in terms of trying to get anything done. It's completely partisan.
It's very unfortunate. The Senate is a difficult place to get anything done. Keep in mind that the men who wrote the American Constitution, 45 colonists who gathered in Philadelphia in the summer of 1787, had two central objectives. The first was independence. They had lived under a British king. They did not want there ever to be an American king. To implement that, they devised a system with internal tensions. One historian exaggerated to make a point in saying they wanted to prevent bad things from happening, and the mechanism they used to accomplish that was to prevent anything from happening. So the Senate, the U.S. Senate, is a microcosm of the American system. Very easy to prevent things from happening, very difficult to make things happen.
But has that been exaggerated over the years? I mean,
yes.
As each senator, I mean, probably when you started, your entourage was smaller than a typical senator's today. I mean, has it become a massive machine?
It has, and it's become highly polarized and far less productive and effective. But remember, there is a strain in American life, in American society and politics that is deeply hostile to the government and to government action. And so for them, a Senate that does nothing is not a bad thing. It's very difficult for those of us who believe, as I do, that government can be a force for good if properly utilized and harnessed. And right now, it's more polarized than it's been in my lifetime in history, in an unfortunate way. We had tough politics when I was there. We had a lot of disagreement. But there was a personal comity, a sense that we have a higher loyalty to the nation, to the institution of the Senate, to the American people, and that we did often subordinate our political differences to enact important legislation. That's pretty much gone now, and I think it's very unfortunate.
Do you feel in any way sorry for what's happened to the Republican Party? I mean, they can't attract the votes of the Hispanics, for example. They have alienated so many of the broad constituency that you need if you want to get a president elected, for example.
I think in any democracy, a vigorous opposition is essential. There is, it's been said many times, including by Thomas Jefferson and Bacon in the UK, power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. And I think that's true of most human beings. You need a check on those in power, however well-intentioned and benign they may seem when they acquire power. So I think it's unhealthy for the American system not to have a vigorous opposition. However, I think the Republicans have a lot of very smart people. They see what's happened. I think that they are gradually shifting their ground back toward the middle to try to attract the broad middle in the American system. And as one evidence of it, just this week in the House of Representatives and the Senate, they agreed to a budget, rather minimal budget. It's already under fire from the Tea Party segment of the Republican Party, but my prediction is that it will pass, and it reflects a recognition that they've got to get back into the center where American elections on a national level are decided.
I'd like to talk to you, obviously, about your time in Ireland. I mean, I don't know how many air miles you clocked up in that period. Some extraordinary figure, I'm sure.
Yeah.
But we'll do that after this break. Senator George Mitchell is with me in studio, and we're talking about his life and times. But we have to talk, of course, about Northern Ireland, which you've described your mission there as the most difficult thing you've had to do in your career.
It was until I went to the Middle East. Just recently, I spoke to a large group of Irish Americans, many Irish citizens there in New York City, and I said to them that I'm about to say something I never dreamed I would think or say, but it is that after 2.5 years in the Middle East dealing with Israelis and Arabs, the Irish were easy. Now, it didn't seem that way in Ireland. The Middle East is a little more complicated, but it was a difficult time. I was there overall about 5 years. I chaired 3 separate sets of discussion before, during the main negotiations, then after in 1999 when the process collapsed. I was asked to go back. But I'll tell you, I came to really love Northern Ireland, the people, the place. I'm an American, proud of it, always will be, but a large part of my heart and emotions will always be in Northern Ireland. They're wonderful people. They're energetic. They're warm, at least to outsiders. They are talkative, argumentative, occasionally contentious. On the very first day the negotiations began, I'll never forget this, a great guy, David Irvine, said to me in a loud voice, Senator, he said, if you are to be of any use to us, there's one thing you must know. I said, what is it? He said, we in Northern Ireland would drive 100 miles out of our way to receive an insult. And I never forgot that.
When I was talking to Tony Blair a couple of years back, and he was talking about the necessity for constructive ambiguity. In other words, you do deals with people which can mean whatever it is convenient for them to mean at that particular time.
The Good Friday Agreement was a political compromise of necessity, and as such, it provided resolution to as many issues as possible, didn't address every single issue, deferred some to others. It specifically created a couple of commissions to deal with particularly thorny issues like policing and the justice system and so forth, and some of the issues some of the provisions could have been interpreted in different ways, but overall, it was a remarkable achievement, and it represented the best that could be done under the circumstances which existed. I said on the day that we reached and announced the agreement that by itself it would not guarantee peace or political stability or reconciliation, but it made those possible. I predicted that it would take many years and many difficult decisions until those objectives were achieved, and I think it's still an ongoing process.
Yeah. Well, Richard Haas, whom you know well, is currently in Northern Ireland chairing talks to address a number of contentious things, the flags issue, and there was a suggestion that maybe a new Northern Ireland flag might be the answer. No way, said the loyal side immediately. The question of parades, and you can see why people so attached to history might want traditional routes for parades, even though life and circumstance and demography has changed utterly. And then the third issue, which has come up again and again about the disappeared and so on, is the past. How do you deal with the past? Do you forgive and forget, or do you forgive but remember, or what do you do?
I know Richard very well. He's a good friend and a very able negotiator. I think he'll do the best job possible in these circumstances. But I don't think it would help him or the participants in the process for me to begin commenting in detail on it, because unfortunately I think my words would be given a disproportionate weight. I do know this, however. Every society has its problems. I'm an American, and boy, do we have problems. So Northern Ireland continues to have problems. The difference there is that they are all seen in the context of the past violence. There is no society that is free of issues, free of difficulties, free of controversy. The important thing is to resolve them in a democratic and peaceful way as they arise, and then it is a fact of life that the solution to every human problem contains within it the seeds of a new problem, and society moves forward and you deal with those other issues. So in a sense, what is happening is important and could be in a beneficial way if it demonstrates once again, and I hope it will, that these issues can be resolved through democratic and nonviolent means.
And that is the hope. If you had any thoughts for Richard on the nature of the kind of people he's going to meet and how he would talk to them, what would your reflections be?
Well, the most important thing, of course, for any negotiator is to understand that it is the parties who own the process. I understood and said repeatedly during the long time I was in Northern Ireland that when we finished, I would be going home to the United States. They would be staying there to live the consequences. And so I was acutely aware that this was their process. In fact, I said on the first day, I don't come here with an American proposal. There is no Mitchell plan. There is no Clinton plan. Any agreement will be yours. And when nearly 2 years later I presented them with a document, I pointed out orally and in writing on a cover letter to them, this was their agreement. Every single word in the Good Friday Agreement was either spoken or written by someone from Northern Ireland. I made sure of that when I, with General de Chastelain and Prime Minister Hockery, drafted the plan. That's the most important thing. Keep in mind it's their problem, but it's their lives and their issues, and you have to make sure they feel ownership.
Trip back to Northern Ireland with your son, the documentary that was made. Now,
when I completed my service in Northern Ireland, I wrote a book. And I concluded the book by saying, just telling the story of how on that last day, when we got the agreement, we were all exhausted, very emotional. And I said to the delegates that for me, this agreement represented a dream that had sustained me through the difficult years we'd been through the long, torturous problems that we had. And now I said I have a new dream. And it is to come back someday to Northern Ireland with my young son, who had been born just a few months earlier. And we'll go and sit in the gallery at the Northern Ireland Assembly, and we'll watch the democratic process at work discussing education, healthcare, all of the issues of a democracy. I said there will be no talk of war, because the war will have long been over. There will be no talk of peace, because peace will by then be taken for granted. And 2 years ago, an independent television producer in Belfast, Trevor Burney, a wonderful guy, called me and said, "Have you ever made that trip back?" I said, "Well, no." He said, "Have you thought about it?" I said, "Well, occasionally I've thought about it." He said, "Well, if you would like to do it, we'd like to film it." And they had found the 61 children who had been born on the same day as my son. I'd referred to that in my book as well.
And you named your son?
I named my son Andrew, and I said to him when he was 1 day old, when I decided then I would go back to Northern Ireland after his birth, I had been in doubt. I said to him, he didn't hear or understand me. He heard me, didn't understand me, of course. I said, if we get peace, I'm going to call it Andrew's peace. And so we did go back to Northern Ireland last year. My whole family, we had a wonderful time there filming the documentary. My children enjoyed it, and we hope to do a similar thing here in the Republic sometime in the next year or two.
Now, you got the call from yet another president. President Clinton had brought you into the Northern Ireland peace process, and then President Obama called upon your services. Did you at any point say to him, "Hang on a second, I've done my bit. I've done my bit for Northern Ireland. I've served. I've travelled so many miles over and back across the Atlantic. Don't ask me to do it again, but this time in the Middle East"?
No. I've been very lucky in my life. I believe in the American dream because I've lived it. I've had opportunities that my parents could never have dreamed of, and I've been very lucky. And I believe that everyone who enjoys the benefits of democracy has a responsibility to serve when called upon and when you feel you can do something. And so I didn't hesitate, and I told the president, the only thing I said to him is, I can't do 4 years. I said, I've just done 5 years in Northern Ireland. I've got 2 young kids. I got married late in life. I had children late in life. They're now teenagers. And I said, in fact, they're the same age as the president's children. So I said to him, look, you've got 2 kids. You're going to see them grow up. You're going to see them get jobs, get married, have children. I'm not. And I've got to spend time with my children. So he said, how long will you serve? I said, 2 years. He said, that's a deal. So we shook hands. I spent 2.5 years there. But I didn't hesitate. People ask me all the time, well, did you think you could get it done, not get it done? That never entered my mind, either in Northern Ireland or in the Middle East. If you get called upon to serve, you serve and do your best, whatever the circumstances.
The intractable nature of the problem, I mean, you have so many issues. The integrity of the state of Israel, can it survive against a background of Arab states and, of course, the Iranians, the Persians as they would be, and then within the Muslim world there are the Shias and the Sunnis, who have massive issues with each other. When they choose to have massive issues, there is intermarriage, as I learned from Robert Fisk, between Sunni and Shia, or has been in the past. But it's such a complex tapestry. We thought Northern Ireland was complex, but this is...
Yes, it is. The Sunni-Shia schism began almost at the birth of Islam. When the Prophet Muhammad died, there was a competition for succession. And out of that competition, too complicated to go into here, the Sunni-Shia divide emerged. It has flared up and then gone into remission, flared up and gone into remission in the 1,300 years of Islam's existence. It is now in a period of intense conflict, and it is increasing. It is going to be one of the dominant factors in deciding the future of the Arab world. The so-called Arab Spring, now the Arab revolutions, is in effect the collapse of the political order that was established in the aftermath of the First World War, when the Ottoman Empire collapsed, which had been in control of that region for over 400 years. That's now being replaced. We don't know how, when, or what will replace it, but there will be a period of turmoil during which their populations will grow dramatically. Of all the figures that I could cite, I'll cite just a couple that make the point. Right now, there are 7 billion people on Earth. It took 1,800 years following the birth of Christ to reach 1 billion. The most recent billion, the 7th, was added in 13 years. While the rate of increase is declining, nonetheless, the total population is increasing. Of the 7 billion people on Earth now, 1 out of 5 is Muslim, about 1.2 billion. When the population approaches 10 billion, as it will sometime following 2050, about mid-century, 1 out of 3 will be Muslim. 3.5 billion Muslims will be on this earth. To give you some context, that was the total population of the world as recently as 1970. And that means the Sunni-Shia divide and the contest within Islam in both sides of this, between those who want to impose theocratic states and those moderates who want to have democratic institutions and the same opportunities and freedom, good life for their kids that people the world over want. That's going to be a decisive factor. And we in the West, and in particular the United States, have to figure out a way to address this in a way that supports those who, and I think they're the majority, the moderates. Of course, the violence gets the attention, and moderation never gets, you're a newsman. It's not news. We have to do the best we can, not to control it, because it's not up to us to direct other people's lives, but it's up to us to try to help move them to make the right choice and move in the direction that provides opportunity and freedom for every person in the Muslim world, just as we in the West value opportunity and freedom.
If you think of the Reformation half a millennium ago, the Christian churches have by and large sorted out their differences and they can live together. They don't take axes or guns to each other. But after more than a millennium of conflict between Sunni and Shia, it does seem it's an imperative that some sort of peace process be organised in the next decade or two to avoid the possibility of massive numbers of opposing Muslims having a go at each other?
Yeah, well, that's going to be their decision, though, and there are the many brilliant and able people in the Muslim world, and people who want to have the same kind of opportunity, freedom, a good life for their children that we in the West want, and that's what we should be supportive of.
The American dream, you've mentioned it a couple of times in our conversation, and there is a practical manifestation of the American dream, isn't there, when you have citizenship ceremonies?
Yes.
And you've presided over those.
I did. Before I entered the Senate, I was a federal judge in the United States. A wonderful position, one that I was reluctant to give up, but I ended up doing so. And I loved it, most especially when I presided over what we call naturalization ceremonies, which are citizenship ceremonies. People came from all over the world, gone through all the required procedures, and then gathered before me in a federal courtroom in my home state of Maine. And there I administered to them the oath of allegiance to the United States. And by the power vested in me under our Constitution and law, I made them Americans. It was always a highly emotional ceremony for me because, as we said earlier, my mother was an immigrant, my father the orphaned son of immigrants. After each ceremony, I made it a point to speak personally with each new American, individually or in family groups. I asked them where they came from, how they came, why they came, what were their hopes, what were their dreams. It was fascinating to talk with them. And although there were many different stories, different countries, different people, there were some common themes, and it was best summarized by a young Asian man who, when I asked him why he came, replied in very slow and broken English. I came, he said, because in America everybody has a chance. And I've often reflected on the fact that a young man who'd have been an American for 10 minutes, who could barely speak English, really summed up the meaning of America in a single sentence. Yeah. Our country is freedom and opportunity. And right now, we are engaged in a huge contest in the United States over what to do about immigration. You follow that, and that's of great interest over here because there are so many people.
The undocumented Irish in America who are numerous.
States. And what I've said often is my father's parents and my mother were like most of the millions who came to the United States. They did not come because we have the best cruise missiles. They did not come because we had the most military might. They came because in America they thought there would be opportunity for them and, most importantly, for their children. The influence of the United States in the world is great. It is the dominant power and is going to be for many, many years to come. Some in our country and increasingly abroad have come to believe that our influence is based exclusively on our military strength and our economic power. While they are valuable and necessary to ensure our security and safety, I believe that the principal basis of American influence in the world is our ideals. The ideals set forth in the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, not easily summarized, but the primacy of individual liberty, the consent of the governed necessary for any authority by government, the rule of law applied not only to every citizen but crucially to the government itself, opportunity for all citizens in society. Ours is an imperfect society, as are all human institutions and all human beings. But there is in America a constant restless striving to right the wrongs of the past, to expand our concept and definition of human rights and civil rights and what it means to be a citizen in a democratic society. And the crucial part of that to me is everybody has a chance. I'm living proof of that. My mother could not read or write. She spent 40 years working nights in a textile mill. My father was the orphan son of Irish immigrants who had little education. He worked as a janitor. But because of their efforts, and most importantly, because of the openness of American society, I was able to get an education and to become the majority leader of the United States Senate. And the challenge we have now is to make certain that we continue our efforts to live up to that aspiration.
It's a wonderful aspiration. I mean, in your presidents, a young fellow from Hope, Arkansas, another man of African and Caucasian parentage in Barack Obama. By the way, do you have a favorite president between the two of them?
Well, every American, of course, thinks that Lincoln was the greatest president in history. And one of the huge ironies, it's interesting that I talked to one of the guys who was a part producer on the film Lincoln, and I said, isn't it odd that to play the role of the quintessential American, the most popular American in history, you had to get a guy that was born in Dublin and lives in London?
Well, he has a home in Wicklow as well. So.
He's a great actor, though. He did a wonderful job. I think for most, I wouldn't say all, Washington was a great man also. We've had many great presidents, and we've had many failures. Look, democracy doesn't guarantee a good result. It guarantees a fair process.
All right. One final point. It's only a small thing, but when we offered you coffee, you said, no, thank you. I'll have water.
It's an interesting story. You mentioned Ronald Reagan earlier. Each January, the President of the United States delivers a State of the Union address to a joint session of the Congress. And there's a small group of senators and House members who are designated to be the welcoming committee for the President. So when the President walks into the Capitol, we meet him and we take him into a small room, not much bigger than the room we're in now, and there's a little chit-chat as we're waiting for the President to be introduced to speak. So I was on that committee several times, and once when Reagan came up, I said to him, is there anything we can get you before you deliver your address? He said, well, yeah, so would you get me a cup of really hot water? I said, hot water? I said, you want any tea in it? No, just hot water. So I had a fellow go out and bring back the hot water. I handed it to him. He said, I can tell you're wondering why I'm drinking hot water. I said, well, yes, I am. He said, it soothes your throat. It makes your voice come across better, kind of a vague explanation. And he said, you know where I got this idea? I said, no. He said, Frank Sinatra told me. I said, well, Mr. President, if it's good enough for Frank Sinatra and for you, it's good enough for me. And I've been drinking hot water before it appears ever since.
I should emulate you, but I don't think so. I think I need this, this shot of coffee every morning. Right. Senator George Mitchell, what a pleasure it has been to have you in our studio today. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you for having me. It's been a real pleasure to see you.